Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is the novelization of Halloween by Curtis Richards. Now, the author's real name is Richard Curtis, but I'm going to refer to him by his pen name only because there is actually a screenwriter named Richard Curtis, and to the best of my knowledge, they are two different people. Now, for the longest time, I actually thought this book was written by Dennis Etcherson, who also wrote the novelizations for Halloween 2 and Halloween 3. He wrote those novelizations under the pen name Jack Martin. Actually, last year, me and several friends of mine did a retrospective on the Halloween series, and my friend Bill said that this book was written by Dennis Etcherson, but after looking it up, I realized that, no, that's false, so I do apologize for that fake news. Now, for those of you who don't know what novelizations are basically books based on movies. Now, novelizations are not as popular as they used to be with the advent of stuff like VHS and now DVDs, Blu-rays, and streaming, but back before the time of home video, a lot of the times once a movie left theaters, that was it. Like, the only time you were ever going to see the movie again is if you happened to catch it on TV. So, novelizations were basically a way for people to re-experience a film, but now, of course, with home video, they're kind of obsolete, but they still happen. Like, I have seen novelizations for recent films. And a lot of the times, novelizations are written concurrently with the production of the movie, or they're based on earlier drafts of the script, so a lot of the times novelizations end up being radically different than the movies. For example, the Alien novelization by Alan Dean Foster. That book is pretty true to the movie, however the Alien is much different in the book than it is in the movie. Now, this novelization was published in 1979, a year after the movie came out. Now, the novelization of Halloween is interesting to say the least. Now, one of the great things about the original Halloween is you really weren't sure if Michael Myers was just a crazy guy or if there was something supernatural going on, and you never knew why he was doing what he was doing. Like, you had the implication that Michael Myers might be some kind of supernatural being, but that was never said flat out. But this book actually tells you why Michael Myers is doing this, and it does give a supernatural explanation for why he's doing this. It actually seems like Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, might have taken some inspiration from this book. In Halloween 6, you actually find out that the reason Michael Myers is killing people is because he's possessed by a demon called Thorn, and there's this cult that worships Thorn who are sort of pulling Michael Myers' strings. That one is pretty ridiculous, and the sequels that followed it completely ignored that one. But after reading this novelization, I realized that a lot of that crazy shit that was in Halloween 6 didn't come out of nowhere. Like, there's no cult in this book, but this does sort of give the explanation of demonic possession, or at least spiritual possession. Like, this book actually begins thousands of years in the past, where you see this ancient Celtic civilization, and there's this guy who is deformed, and he's humiliated by this girl who is the daughter of a king, and he brutally murders her along with her lover, so the people of this community execute him and put a curse on him where his soul is now doomed to roam the earth for all eternity. So the whole idea here is that Michael Myers is possessed by the spirit of this guy, and this also gives sort of a familial aspect to it, where you find out that Michael Myers' great-grandfather was also possessed by this spirit, and he also committed murders. It also seems like Rob Rob Zombie might have taken some inspiration from this book for his remake of Halloween, because you do get a few scenes of a young Michael Myers at the psychiatric hospital. But besides giving Michael Myers a supernatural origin, I have to say that this book is actually pretty true to the John Carpenter film. And it's the same basic plot. Michael Myers escapes from the psychiatric hospital on Halloween night, and he starts stalking babysitters, particularly this one babysitter named Laurie Strode. And Sam Loomis, his psychiatrist, is now trying to stop him. Now, personally, I recommend the novelization of Halloween, especially if you're a fan of the movie and if you're a fan of the franchise overall. I could see some purists having an issue with giving Michael Myers a supernatural origin, but you gotta understand, when Richard Curtis wrote this book, he wrote it before Halloween really became a franchise. And also, this is just a book that's based on the movie. I look at it as a completely separate continuity than the continuity of the film. This book also gives some pretty interesting insights into the characters. Now, whether you want to count those insights as canon or not is completely up to you, but in this book you find out that Sam Loomis actually has a wife and son, something that's not even remotely hinted about in the original film or any of the sequels. This also sort of explains why the character of Linda, the character played by PJ Soles in the movie, always says totally. Like, in the book it explains that basically every few months she has a new word that she says all the time, and this month it was totally. I thought that was actually kind of cute. This also gives you a lot of new insights into characters like Annie and Laurie, of course, and it really does do a good job at making the characters seem a lot more three-dimensional than they were in the movie. Now, don't get me wrong, I liked the characters in the movie, but I never really saw them as, like, these complex three-dimensional characters, at least not the teenage characters. Sam Loomis I always saw as sort of this really complex, interesting character, but I never really found the teenage characters in Halloween to be like these really deep characters, but this book actually does add a lot of characterization to them. Now, one scene in this book that I really liked, and it is based on a scene from the movie, but it sort of expands upon it. In the movie, there's the scene where Sheriff Brackett accidentally scares Laurie. This book kind of expands on that scene where Laurie actually tries to kick him, and Sheriff Brackett's like, hey, you're doing that wrong, and basically he teaches her sort of like self-defense, and it's actually a really cool scene in the book, because it really shows you just how good of a guy Sheriff Brackett really is. Also in the movie, you had the scene where Laurie and Annie were smoking weed, and then they pulled up the Sheriff Brackett. Sheriff Brackett is Annie's father, and Annie's trying to hide the fact that she was smoking weed, but in this book you realize that he knew very well she was smoking weed, but he kind of figured, hey, they're kids do this shit, and he kind of chose to look the other way, so it shows that Sheriff Brackett really is just a cool guy. So that's something I really liked about this book, is it definitely added a little more depth to the characters. Now, one thing I thought was interesting is, in Halloween 2, you find out that Laurie Strode is Michael Myers' sister, something that got completely retconned in the most recent Halloween movie, but in the second film it's revealed that they're brother and sister. Oddly enough, that's kind of foreshadowed in this book a little bit, where basically there's a point where Michael Myers, when he sees Laurie, he thinks she looks like Judith, who was his older sister who he murdered when he was 6 years old. So, once again, I recommend the novelization of Halloween. I thought it was a very interesting read. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this book is out of print, but if you could find a copy of this, I definitely recommend it, and bye.